Hello, my name is Andrea Cordaro, and in this video I'd like to talk about light trapping in 3.5 on silicon tandem solar cells. So before doing so, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators from Fraunhofer ISE in the group of Benedict Placey, Nico Tucher, Hubert Hauser, and Oliver Hun, as well as my supervisor Albert Polman and my office mate Stefan Tabernig. So light trapping is important because it enables thinner cells, and numerous benefits are expected from thinner cells. So obviously less material is used, and this means cost reduction but also a higher throughput. Also, thinner cells enables novel applications. So for example, where lightweight is important, so for example automotive application or space application, or it could enable, for example, flexible solar cells, for example, for wearable application. But it's also important for efficiency. So, for example, when the diffusion length is comparable to the cell thickness, this actually helps for charge collection. Also, with the same thickness, if you have light trapping strategies, you can enhance the optical absorption. Now, the device we're working with is a tandem solar cell consisting of a 3.5 top cell, which is wafer bonded to a silicon bottom cell. So one key issue with this type of device is basically harvesting the light in the silicon bottom cell at wavelengths close to the bandgap of silicon. So here, for example, I plot the absorption length in log scale versus wavelength, and then as you can see that basically the absorption length becomes comparable to the entire cell thickness, basically around 1100 nanometer or so. So basically this means that light is not fully absorbed by just having light passing twice through the cell. So the idea here is to have a pattern back reflector, so diffraction grating at the back of the silicon bottom cell, in order to steer light at an angle that is totally internally reflected, so that light is basically trapped into the silicon. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the unit cell of such a grating. So first of all, we can choose to pattern either the silicon or the silver back reflector, and here we choose to pattern the silver in order to avoid parasitic surface recombination in silicon. So we want to avoid to pattern silicon. We want to keep it flat. Then the goal of such a design is basically again to steer light at an angle that is greater than the critical angle for total internal reflection at the silicon air interface, which is about 16 degrees. Now, to do so, we can basically play with three parameters: the period of the of the unit cell, the height of this silver nanodisk, and its radius. Now, there are constraints on the periodicities that are given by the grating equation, as we'll see in a minute. While basically, in order to optimize the radius and the height of such a silver nanodisk, we actually need to perform FDTD simulations. So let's take a look at the periodicity constraints. So basically, here's the grating equation. So we have the angle at which light is diffracted depends on the diffraction order, the wavelength, and the periodicity. And basically, from here, we can already see that the periodicity has to be greater than a certain minimum periodicity in order to have diffraction over the entire bandwidth we're working with. So basically, you don't want the grating to be subwavelength at any wavelength. On the other hand, the periodicity has to be less than a certain maximum periodicity in order to avoid having the first diffraction order inside the escaping cone, so to avoid losing light. Now, in order to find the exact parameters, we use an optimization algorithm, which is called particle swarm optimization. And here in this little cartoon, you can see all these red crosses moving around in order to find this local minimum. And basically, each cross is basically a different simulation that is wandering around to explore the parameter space. Now, the figure of merit that we used is to minimize the reflection to zero order plus the parasitic optical absorption happening at the back reflector. This is exactly equivalent as maximizing the light steered at an angle. And we come up with this optimal parameters for radius, height, and the pitch. Also, it's important to mention that this optimization has been performed for unpolarized light, so basically averaging between the two polarization. Now, let's take a look at the reflection to zero order and the absorption of the optimal structure. So this is basically reflection straight back to the zero order as a function of the wave, and you can see is really low. It's basically below 1% here. And the absorption is a couple percent higher than a standard flat mirror that basically reflects 95% of the light and roughly absorbs 5%. So here we're, of course, above the flat mirror, but we don't have any absorption peaks due to resonant absorption. Okay, next we check how the light is redistributed. So you can see here, light is basically steered outside the escaping cone here in red, and roughly at angles, azimuthal angles of about 45 degrees. So here you can see better how light is redistributed in roughly 6 diffraction channels. What is important to see is also to explore the parameter space around the optimum to understand actually why we have an optimum around those parameters. So here basically we have these two color maps. So one is reflection to the zeroth order averaged in the bandwidth of interest, which is 1000 to 1200 nanometers in wavelength, as a function of height of the silver nanodisk and the periodicity of the grating, while keeping a constant fill factor. So basically each pixel in this color map is a different simulation, and the wavelength is basically squeezed into a third dimension, which is inside the screen. Okay, so what you can see here is also that I added the line which marks the onset of diffraction. So on the left of this line, for at least one wavelength, we have no diffraction, while on the right we do have diffraction channels, as you can see here in this cartoon. So basically, if we only have one channel available, then in order to have low reflection to zero order, we actually need to absorb a lot of light into the silver. So this is basically not useful. So we want to stay on the right of this line to have more channels, and then we can have low zero order reflection while also have low absorption. Next, we take a crosscut of this color map at roughly at the minimum of reflection to zero order, and basically the crosscut is still a color map, since we have for each pixel we still have the wavelength information. And now from this color map we can basically notice that the reflection to zeroth order has a dependence on lambda and on the height, which is similar to that of a Fabry-Perot type of interference. In fact, the minimum and the maximum of such a color map can be reproduced with such a simple model, where basically light is bouncing off the bottom of the back reflector and on the top of the silver nanodisk, and is basically interfering. So when you have destructive and constructive interference in the zero order reflection, you have a minimum or a maximum. So basically, what is happening is that we have we have a certain number of channels available, and then the zero order channel is basically forbidden by this destructive interference. So light has to go has to be reflected at an angle. So it's really not a plasmonic resonant effect. And actually we wanted to avoid that because this would mean parasitic optical absorption. Okay, but this is really part of the problem that we have discussed so far, because basically so far we have modeled the interaction of the grating within the first path. So basically we have light coming in, and then it's steered at an angle. But then after the first pass, it has to interact with the grating again. So basically we need to also model this. So in order to actually calculate the absorption of the entire cell in the silicon, so the absorption in silicon, we actually need to calculate the full scattering matrix of the grating. So basically the reflection into each channel, but also coming from each channel. So once we have that information, it is possible to calculate the absorption as shown in this paper from our collaborators, and assuming such a structure. So with a double anti-reflection coating, silicon of standard thickness, and the back reflector, for which we know the scattering matrix. So what you can see here is the absorption in silicon as a function of wavelength, and here we're comparing the cell with just a flat back reflector, then the current world record, which is from this paper, 2018, and this is experimental data, and our optimized simulated back reflector. So as you can see, actually this looks promising, as our grating is doing better than the one in this paper. Also, you can calculate the reflection of the entire stack. As you can see also here, the reflection is really low except in this region, and you can also calculate the absorption, the parasitic absorption happening in the silver, which is basically comparable to the one here in green, except here is a bit lower. Okay, next let's talk about fabrication. So for clarity here, I want to stress again that light is coming from the 3.5 side, but actually we do our fabrication at the back. So here basically this cartoon is to say that we flip the sample and then we start bottom up from the silicon side. Okay, so first we spin coat PMMA, and the thickness is equal to the final thickness of the silver nanodisc, and then we spin coat this sol gel, which I'll describe in a minute, and then we can imprint the sol gel. So this is nano imprint lithography. I'll come back to this in a minute. Then we basically break through this tiny residual layer of sol gel, and we etch the PMMA with reactive ion etching, and we basically reach the silicon. Then we basically perform a wet etch in HF to remove the sol gel, but also to remove the native oxide, so that we can basically make sure that we have proper electrical contact. And then after that, basically we're ready to fill the holes with silver, so we evaporate silver. So I want to talk a little more about imprint lithography. Basically, to pattern large areas, or we're talking about centimeters here, multiple times, then e-beam lithography is really impractical, so that would be too long. So here we use SPIE, which is soft conformal imprint lithography, where basically one big master is patterned once with e-beam, and then a PDMS stamp is basically molded from this master, and then the PDMS stamp can be used to pattern Sol-Gel as many times as we want. So basically the long procedure of patterning silicon Epton once, and then this basically takes about 10 minutes to pattern full 2.5 by 2.5 centimeters area. So on the right here you can see how such a stamp looks like. So here we have the PDMS, and here we have a glass back sheet. Okay, so here is an SEM of the sample after the HF removal. So you can see basically the holes of PMMA on silicon that are ready to be filled with silver. Here you can see basically the silver filling up the holes nicely and uniformly. So basically this would be the back contact, and this would be the silicon substrate, so the cell, and then the light is coming from the bottom up in this specific picture. So here you can see another SEM, a little more of a cross section, and you can see here the pillars are nice and straight and fully connected. So in this, evaporation is basically important that the evaporation is nice and straight. Otherwise you can get weird shapes, or you can even have hair inclusions in the back reflector. Okay, then finally I want to show some interesting initial results on the optical characterization. Here you can see the back side of the pattern sample. So here's the pattern, here's the basically outside the pattern. So this would be flat silver, and this is pattern silver, and then the silicon is on the other side of this picture. So if we measure the reflectance from the silicon side, then you can see that basically until basically 1000 nanometer, then what we really see is basically the reflection of the front surface of silicon. But then here silicon is basically a little more transparent, so we start for the flat cell, we start really see the flat mirror. So basically light can basically make it through and escape again. While for the pattern one, actually we have a huge reduction of the reflection. So this looks very promising, and we're now waiting for basically an electrical characterization of these samples. Okay, thanks for watching this video, and I'll be happy to reply offline to all your questions.